I was saying a while ago that one of the good things about terrorism, it tends to move. The one part of the world where it has not moved in 50 years is Israel-Gaza. If you could somehow get the Palestinians and now maybe the Syrians looking more like Qatar or Dubai or some of the successful parts of the Middle East, there might be some hope for the future. But getting there is not obviously an easy task, and no one in the world has been able to come up with a solution.
We haven't invaded Qatar, right, and these other countries, so it doesn't seem like the American interventions are a positive thing for these nations. Welcome to another episode of National Champion Radio. We are honored to welcome Dr. Gary Lafree. He's a trailblazing criminologist and recent recipient of the prestigious Stockholm Prize in Criminology. It's the field's highest global honor. As the founding director of START, the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, Lafree has redefined how the world understands policing, terrorism, and social order. His groundbreaking research on procedural justice and legitimacy has influenced police reform, counterterrorism strategy, and public trust in law enforcement. With a career spanning decades, Lafree's work extends from understanding street crime all the way to shaping global perspectives on government legitimacy during wars and during crisis. His insights continue to inform current geopolitical conflicts in places like Gaza, Israel, and Russia, offering a timely and essential lens for policymakers, scholars, and citizens alike. This episode dives into his journey, his landmark contributions to criminology, and how his work is shaping the future of justice, peace, and global security. For those esteemed honors, we are really thrilled to welcome Dr. Gary Lafree to National Champion Radio. Season 2 of National Champion Radio is finally here. I'm going to bring you some more episodes over the next few weeks. We had an amazing season 1. You saw Olympic gold medalists. You saw astrophysicists. You saw doctors who had cures for Alzheimer's. You saw surgeons, and we just tried to bring you human excellence. But we didn't choose our own excellence to bring you. We just found the most celebrated awards in the world, and we brought those people onto the show. And I'm so pumped that we're able to get nearly 5,000 subscribers on YouTube in a part-time. This is something that we do part-time. We would love your support to do this full-time. You can support us by just watching more episodes and engaging with the content, subscribing on the content. That will really help us to be able to do this full-time. You can check out our Patreon, but you can also invest in us, not just supporting on Patreon and doing it out of the kindness of your heart, which is awesome. You can also do it out of the thoughtfulness of your wallet in the future. This is a cultural tech platform. We're bringing people to this platform to help ground us and be a cultural hub for excellence as we move forward. We're remembering the greatness of the contributions of those in the past. We're celebrating the people who are winning awards now in the present. And we're using that to harness and actually create the future, because we all have a responsibility to create the future and build something that can help bring our country and our species together. That's what National Champions Institute is. We want to bring together this nation and this species. Right now, there's a lot of division. There's a lot of division right now and a lot of confusion and uncertainty, and it's only going to get more confusing and more uncertain with deep fakes and all types of, wild technologies coming down the pipe from bad actors. We need good actors. We need people who've dedicated their lives to just doing good, who really are living humble lives, most of these people. Most of these people don't want the spotlight. Most of these people are just living, going about their lives, and then they happen to be great at something, and they continue to work on it. And then they continue to work on it. And honestly, they still don't really get a lot of praise. We don't have a culture that gives the right attention to the right people. And we all know it. We all know that our attention has been decayed. And we wonder why there's division. We wonder why we're uninformed about the things that are most important. So we're just trying to bring it to you here on National Champion Radio and with the National Champions Institute. Thank you for everybody who's watched a single second of a single episode, everybody who's subscribed. If you haven't and you watched this far, please subscribe. Please go check us out. Become an investor, or just, give $3 a month in support of this endeavor and what we're building. I promise you will not be disappointed. And so, like we said, the field of criminology, never boring. It's always something going on. Maybe you can just kind of briefly explain what criminology is for someone who has maybe never heard of it before?
Well, the usual explanation of criminology is that it consists of two main questions, basically. Why do people commit crime? Or for that matter, why don't they commit crime? And also, how does the criminal justice system process cases? So how does policing work? How do courts work? How do prosecutors work? And so on. So the first is usually about criminology and the second criminal justice.
I see. And so, I mean, how did you get into that space? How did you decide to go down that path? I guess it's some mixture somewhere between law and sociology. I mean, maybe that's it's sitting in between those two.
That's a great observation. In fact, in most of the world, criminology is connected with law schools. The United States is actually one of the outstanding examples of it instead being connected to sociology. And it's basically was a historical accident because criminology in the United States got started at the University of Chicago back in the 20s and 30s as part of social work programs where they're trying to figure out what was going on in urban areas. Mm-hmm. So criminology in the United States always had a kind of social sciencey connection, which also has made it a lot more empirical, because in law schools it tends to be more like studying the law as opposed to studying data and studying social science issues.
Yeah. Wow. And so that deviation is really what caused it to be where it is now. How did you decide to go down that path? I mean, it's a path that isn't extremely popular, but it's so interesting. I mean, and also, I mean, I will say too, it has a linkage to geopolitics and, political science in that sense as well. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, people, you have your famous political scientists, you have your lawyers, and then, your sociologists, all in one frame. How did you end up getting into that space?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Criminology is very interdisciplinary. You have political science, psychology, sociology, law. Basically, I was planning to be a lawyer, and I got to almost, I guess, a junior undergraduate. I was getting a history degree, because I thought that was good for law. And I got about junior year, and I took a criminology course, and I said, wow, it was really interesting. And then I had this big debate after I graduated whether I go to law school or graduate school. I couldn't really decide. I applied to both, and then the last minute I decided that I would rather study the law than practice it.
Wow. And really your work has since, the work that you've put out has informed lawyers, has informed people in multiple disciplines, right? I mean, it's really exciting to think about how that, groundbreak, that work at the baseline, because a lawyer's not going to sit back all day and say, well, what are the, how are, crime rates changing over the course of 30, 40 years? What are the major determinants that are, causing these things to happen? How can I look under the hood? And really, they're probably just thinking about whatever those, goals that they have at the top of the mind for whatever study or whatever field of law that they're studying. Sometimes the incentives are perverse. They're not always, what we want them to be as far as just a global society, but.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Like if you're a lawyer, you're working on the case that's of concern for you at the moment. If you're studying it, you may be looking instead at 500 cases and how they're similar and different. So very different. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. And so you got on that track. You decided this is the path for me, and then you became one of the greatest criminologists of all time. That's a way to say it.
A heavy label to live up to.
Right. Yeah. No. Yeah, that's a lot to say. But your work in the field has been regarded in the highest regard with the Stockholm Prize in Criminology.
Yes, thank you.
And so congratulations on that. Thanks again for that work. Maybe you can tell us about the prize and, what your work was that got you to be, the recipient of the prize, the co-recipient, I should say.
Correct, yes. I should mention that I received it in conjunction with Tom Tyler, who's a psychologist at Yale University. And we fit together nicely because I tend to do broad historical stuff, and Tom is a psychologist. So he's been interested in legitimacy at the micro level, like how individuals, say, interacting with police officers, like how legitimacy affects that. Whereas I've been more interested in the more macro historical level. So in other words, how legitimacy might affect whole societies at a particular point in time. And basically I won the award especially for a book I wrote about 15 or 20 years ago called Losing Legitimacy, which is a book about a major crime wave in the United States that occurred starting in the 1960s and then sort of ending really in the 70s and 80s, where crime increased very dramatically. And lots of people are interested in trying to figure out what caused that. And in this book, I argue that a loss of legitimacy can really lead to big increases in interpersonal violence. And later, I actually tried applying that as well, not just to crime, but also to political violence like terrorism.
So, I mean, taking a step back, why do people commit crimes? Is it just, is it just the way they were raised? Is it nature versus nurture? Is it, the poor are more likely to commit crimes because they need to go get resources? I know some of the answers to your work, but I'd love you to, go ahead and explain, how you came to the conclusions of how and why people commit crimes.
Yeah, so I had a kind of, I suppose, a gestalt moment. And, my background's in history, so I've always been interested in crime trends more than crime per se.
Okay.
And I was quite interested, and I lived through, actually, the 1960s. I'm old enough to have been around, when there were urban riots in the 1960s and when Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy were killed and during the Watergate scandal and all that period. And I got really interested, especially in this period from 1963 to about 1975. During that period, street crime rates in the United States, I'm talking about, murders, robberies, burglaries, and so on, that those rates, homicide rates doubled, burglary rates tripled, robbery rates about quadrupled. And I started looking around criminology at this point in time, and you have, for example, biological explanations of crime that were popular many years ago, not so popular now, but you have psychological explanations also. And I thought, those don't seem to make sense. I mean, how could those be responsible for things changing so rapidly? Even if you take a lot of social explanations, because there's this one explanation that crime is a sort of subcultural phenomena, and it's sort of repeated from generation to generation. But here we have a period of only a little over a decade, and crime rates are tripling and quadrupling. So I'm thinking we need to explain that. We need to find something that is also capable of very rapid social change. And I'd been doing a bunch of work with various kinds of theorists, and Max Weber, a German sociologist, is famous for making some insights in this area. And he points out that one of probably the signal achievements that humans have that separates us from other animals is that we create social institutions. We create ways of interacting with each other that are mutually shared, essentially. And just to give you a quick example for one of these social institutions, you can imagine many times if you have someone who's a spouse or a significant other, you'll pick one side of the bed or another to sleep on, right? You won't talk about it necessarily, but you're on the right side, your spouse is on the left. And you'll even save that when you're traveling to other places and other countries. And your spouse may get upset if you violate that assumption. That's an example of a very simple kind of institutional agreement. You've both agreed, you don't talk about it, it's an unwritten rule.
Yeah.
But those kinds of institutions built up in a much more formal sense are things like the family, things like the economy, things like political institutions. They're the things that govern our lives, basically. And for the most part, we often don't question those institutions all that much. They're taken for granted. In fact, they work the best when we don't question them, when we don't think about, should I really get married? Should I really go to church? Should I really vote for somebody? All those sorts of things work best when we don't take them for granted. But in a sense, they're made up. I mean, they're not real in the same way that biology or like. So if you compare this kind of behavior to, let's think about what happens when a cat is chasing a mouse. When a cat sees a mouse, it has something biological that says chase the mouse, right? And
Right.
It's very instinctual. It doesn't have to think about it, doesn't have to debate it. I'm a cat, I'm chasing a mouse. Start and end. But when we make decisions as human beings, we're often defined not by our biology, but by the institutions that we're a part of. So this gives us a great advantage in terms of evolution because it means that we can evolve, we can change. Because we created these institutions, we can also change them. But it also means that we're in a very delicate situation, a fragile situation, if you will. Because if those institutions start getting challenged, it means there can be a whole lot of people that aren't following them, that are doing all kinds of deviant behavior, including criminal behavior. So what happened to institutions in the United States during this crime boom period is they were challenged very severely. There was a lot of social unrest in the United States in the 60s and 1970s. There were, of course, these major assassinations of key figures like Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy. There was the Watergate scandal. There was ongoing unrest connected to the Vietnam War. And it was a period where there was a lot of people challenging institutions. And in a sense, if you challenge institutions and you don't follow them, it means it kind of frees you up to engage in behavior of all different types, some of which is criminal behavior. So that, in a nutshell, what I won the award for. Now, we'll get into this, I think, perhaps later, but you can also apply this kind of reasoning to how people get into political violence and even get into committing or getting involved in war.
So, I mean, if I try to summarize that up, I mean, my spouse and I, we might create the institution of sleeping on the left or the right side of the bed.
Yes.
It's something that becomes part of our physiology naturally, that we don't have to think about, almost just like as basic as the fact that we don't have to think about breathing, right? That's biological. That we can just do. We can just breathe. We don't have to worry about it. Yep. Essentially, for these higher order functions of our physiology, we have to create institutions to govern how our bodies are going to move in those spaces, whether or not we're attacking another person when we walk down the street, or we're just walking right by, or even what side of the street we might walk on naturally, right? And we say, wait, why isn't the man on the outside, so that if a puddle splashes, that's what, an institution might tell us we should do, so that, we might feel some kind of way about not seeing that or seeing the woman on the outside just because it's unnatural to our institution. Unlike mice or, cats or whatever, they typically are functioning at the higher order of their physiology, like we are when it comes to breathing.
This is exactly right.
They're just breathing it out, right?
And you can see what a huge advantage this is socially. Or let me give you an example on the social side of things, because this one always amazes me. And I'm sure you've had this experience in your career as well. You show up for a new class the first day of the semester, right? People are all milling around. Some person walks in, some man or woman walks in with a bunch of papers, gets to their desk, starts lecturing, and suddenly everybody stops talking, grabs a seat, pulls out their iPad, starts taking notes, and there's no one who said anything about that. Everybody knows the role, they know the institution, and they immediately follow without ever having met each other before. A bunch of strangers get together and follow this, which is sort of crazy behavior when you think about it.
Yeah, but, right. Yeah.
And this is a super advantage for humans because it makes us adaptable. But there are all sorts of things that could interrupt that wouldn't interrupt the relation between a cat and a mouse, for example. Like, let's say there are protests going on at the university, or students are out because they've raised tuition, or there's a bomb scare. There's all sorts of things that can interrupt that institution. So at once it's more flexible, but it's also, in a sense, more vulnerable to sort of social impacts outside of the system.
Yeah. So it won't function the same way given different circumstances.
Exactly.
As would the mouse. The cat doesn't care about the alarm as much, let's say. It's going to do the same thing when it sees a mouse, basically, right?
Exactly.
It's going to go after the mouse and do what it does.
Well, it allows us to change as the environment changes. I mean, that's, I would say, in some ways, something humans have done better than any other creatures, is that we're able to adapt much more rapidly to social change because we don't rely on hardwired instincts. We rely mostly on social institutions.
So now what's the norm? Crime or a lack of crime? Is the institutions that are teaching us not to do crime, are those the ones that you would expect evolutionarily to expand up into societies that are functioning and healthy, into nation states that can actually govern and do, complex things, versus like if crime was a part of a society at its origins, we'd expect that kind of institution perhaps not to proliferate over generations. And then when those institutions do break down, because they're not real, they're not biological, they're just, underlying mandates that we roll with. We know not to go do push-ups inside a Starbucks. We don't do jumping jacks inside a Starbucks. Right, exactly. We just know. And we know not to, pull out our laptops and, start trying to do work in the middle of the gym, right? Exactly. We know that that's not the right place for that, because each institution or each environment has, set code of standard, that we should rely on. But we know that in these times where people are rioting, in this time where people are doing crime, they basically say, well, I see the veil has been lifted. Mm-hmm. Every place is just another place. Starbucks, the gym, who cares? I'm punching you in the face and I'm stealing your money. Right? Is that kind of getting towards the veil gets lifted once people feel like it's not as legit anymore?
Yeah, I think, with some caveats. I mean, basically, I think you do, in a sense, when you don't have legitimacy in a system, it's like you're almost imposing a tax on everything that happens. Everything becomes more complicated.
Yeah.
Like, for example, you can have your holiday dinners with your family, and you don't have to have police officers there to sort of supervise, right?
Hopefully.
Hopefully not. If you do have police, they might be effective, but you can tell that that's going to really be a much less, sensible kind of social arrangement, and it's going to cost a lot of money. So, like, we can overcome some problems by hiring a lot of police, for example, but it's going to be not as efficient as having us police ourselves, basically, is when we all agree on the rules. But I will put some caveats into that, because there's also some sense in which we probably don't also want to live in a society with no crime. Like, nobody really contemplates like zero crime in a society. In fact, we probably wouldn't want to live in such a society.
Well, that's a statement.
Well, it is. Well, think about how society changes. Like, Martin Luther King is actually a super example of that. I remember the guy went to prison for his belief.
Yeah.
So to some extent, societies also evolve from people who are breaking the rules to some extent.
Right.
And a society that's, like, for example, North Korea right now probably has very low crime rates, but I'm not real fond about the idea of living in North Korea. So a lot of people sort of think, a little bit of crime is probably sustainable, but when you start getting too much crime, it starts to have other kinds of effects, basically, and mostly negative effects. So that we can show, for example, societies with lots of crime have less direct investment. People are less likely to feel freedom or less willing to go outside. There's a whole variety of costs of societies that have a lot of crime.
Yeah, right. I mean, you can't even invest, like you said, you can't even invest in a place that has too much crime. And I'm sure, I know that was part of your work we don't have to go there yet, but we talk about globally, where, globalization does create benefits in the sense that we're not going to invest or go and travel. I mean, we started to hear about all this crime that was happening in Mexico and in South America recently. And it was like, well, we're not going to travel there as tourists. Yeah. So you're going to have a huge depletion. Or, I'm outside of Detroit. And, when the city was high in crime, right after the bankruptcy and around that time, people couldn't invest in the city. You can't build anything if people are just going to come and raid you next week, right? Why even plant the seed and grow the flowers and reap the harvest if the samurais or whatever are just going to come and raid you? You can't have a society that flourishes in that way. Whereas, other places that can just grow, year after year after year and get invested into, because they know that there's a low likelihood that that's going to get, stolen from them. Yeah. So, it makes perfect sense that one of the first things you need to do is to eliminate crime in order to try to get a flourishing society. But it is a great point and interesting to think about, what would a world with no crime be, and then it's like, what are we, just these robots that are, that's what we'd have to be, so draconian, so locked down to where every offense that is recorded in a crime log somewhere could somehow be enforced inside of our physiology. Right? Yeah. Like, there are some old laws, you probably know of some, that are in these books that, you can't ride a horse after midnight, or I don't know. There's all types of crazy state laws that are still in effect, where there are technically crimes, or jaywalking, for example, right? Like, of course, we don't want to eliminate crime at every level. So,
yeah, exactly. I guess we're looking for kind of a sweet spot somewhere with relatively manageable rates, but we don't expect them to disappear entirely.
And so, legitimacy makes sense, it makes sense from the just right away. I think it's easy to look at that tax you're talking about when you talk about just the decisions in life. Should I get married? Should I do this? Should I go to what this institution has put forth? And as soon as I think twice about it, there's complexity. As soon as I say, well, honey, I want to sleep on this side of the bed. And she said, well, no, why?
Yeah.
All of a sudden, we've added complexity. We've started to have a debate. Who knows how that might unravel every time if we had to choose every night which side of the bed to sleep on, if everyone had to choose, how to live their life outside of the established traditions that were passed along.
Yes.
The chaos that would ensue. And so,
yeah,
I guess
that's so true, and I think it's easy to miss that. So you could imagine, again, the classroom situation where instead of everybody grabbing their iPads and taking a seat, well, let's have a debate. What should a classroom be? What should a university be? Who should be giving the instruction? Who should be? If you had to have that debate for all aspects of your life, you'd never get anything done but like this one big debate.
Right.
So, like, institutions are this sort of amazing thing that they make life just so much easier when they are functioning properly.
And so let's talk about, you were looking at between 63 and 75, right? And how these, JFK, MLK,
Yes.
murdering political leaders, getting murdered, getting assassinated, other episodes of political unrest that were occurring eventually disintegrated the social fabric of the institution in a sense. Is that right? Is that how it kind of?
Yeah, and I picked as examples these sort of high profile political things, but in the book I actually looked at things like people have been polled on this question about, do you trust government officials to do the right thing? And the proportion of Americans saying that they did plummeted during this period.
Wow.
All these questions about trust in government, trust in the political process, also trust in the economic system was being challenged. There was a lot of feeling that corporations were greedy and they were being unfair, and that the gap between rich and poor people was growing. So there was a lot of dissatisfaction during this period.
Wow.
And I think, I've done less work on this, but I feel there's a bit of a resurgence of this during the COVID period, where there's been a real decline in trust in institutions once again. And we have also saw with that a bit of a crime rise, at least in the short term. So I think, when people don't think the system is fair and can't trust the system, they're much more likely to not want to follow the rules.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, it's even more, when you think about it, it's a much bigger deal than just following the rules. Like, following the rules fits the individual decision, should I, follow the rules? Should I get a fair job? Should I get married? Whatever the institution is telling you to do. But it's more than that, because it's also whether you support other people following the rules. So, somebody is murdered in a city. Does someone come forward? Does someone trust the police enough to come forward and testify? Do they trust the police enough to actually help in the investigation?
Yeah.
So legitimacy it's broader than just the individual who's making a decision to do one behavior or the other. It's really the whole society that's involved in this process by either supporting institutions or not, and trusting them.
Wow. And so, part of your work, and that makes me think of some of your work when it comes to police brutality, when it came to, black neighborhoods trusting the police and how that impacts. We always, I think I've heard, I don't know how widespread this thought is or knowledge is about, cooperation with the police within the black community.
Yes.
You're right. Being a snitch, on a certain thing. It's like, wait, how can I be a snitch if you killed my brother? You know what I mean? Or something like this, right? This kind of situation. When you talk about 64% of murders going unsolved in the nation, that's about right. Right?
Yeah, certainly big cities, that's pretty accurate, yeah.
In big cities, 64, so it's, you can get away with murder. And that's of the people we known have been murdered, not just like missing people who are maybe perhaps been, put into the bottom of the river or something like this that you never find. That's of the people we know have been murdered, still 2/3 aren't being is it being someone being arrested and prosecuted?
Not even solved, but arrested.
Not even arrested.
The number actually prosecuted and convicted is even lower than that. So these are just cleared by arrest. Wow. So it's a pretty shocking statistic, really.
It is. It's really stark. And so, how might we explain that? Is it explained in part by a lack of trust in the system, people's lack of cooperation with law enforcement. Does law enforcement then have a lack of cooperation with the community, and that plays its role? I mean, how do we talk about or think about 65% of murders in big cities in America not even getting someone to be arrested for them?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a major problem, and I think the explanation probably is a little bit complex. It involves not just citizens but also police behavior. I think from the citizen side, what we do know is that people are much more likely to work with the police, to accept the police when they feel like they're being treated fairly, that they're being heard, that they can have some trust in the police. And a lot of work, and Tom Tyler, the other gentleman who received the Stockholm Prize Award with me, he's done a lot of work on that. It's what we'd say is the micro level, just involving police contacts with ordinary citizens. And even when people know they're guilty, they seem to really respond to police much better when they feel they're being treated fairly, when they're being treated in a non-discriminatory fashion. So from the citizen thing, I think bringing back interaction between police and citizens that's more respectful and treats them in a fair and equitable manner is really critical. On the policing side, part of the work I've been doing for the last 20 years has involved terrorism as opposed to street crime. But the two, I think, in the United States have been connected. After 9/11, I think there was a real tendency for the police to become much more of a military unit than a kind of policing unit. I think partly because of the work on terrorism and the idea of having SWAT teams and coming in hot, basically, that we're starting to look at police as more RoboCop, than officer friendly.
Yeah.
And I think, that's reflected somewhat, I think, in recruitment. I think we can see it somewhat in why people go into policing, that they're not as interested in getting, cats out of the tree for the neighbor than they are, coming in hot and, in a SWAT team situation. But I think that's had some negative impacts on police and their relationship with the community. Like, getting all this old military equipment for police departments, SWAT teams, all of these sorts of things that make the police look like a paramilitary unit, I think raises problems with how they interact with the community. And at the end of the day, this 64% statistic, I think a big part of that reflects citizen willingness to cooperate with the police. The police really... You think about something like 96% of all crimes get to the police because somebody calls them in.
Okay.
If the public doesn't support policing, if they're worried about the police, if they don't trust the police, the system just doesn't work very well. It's a kind of major legitimacy crisis.
Yeah, it seems like that's what we're going through. I mean, that number is just so stark, and to hear that, that is how we're still functioning today, even given technologies, shot spotter. I've heard of this thing.
That does blow me away, frankly. DNA, shot spot. I mean, all of the technological, and it's not universal in the world. I mean, there are countries like Japan that have almost 100% clearance rate for murders.
Wow.
So we are on the lower end of that clearance rate, and we've gotten worse too, actually, over time, which is
my goodness
interesting issue.
Yeah, I mean, is there? I mean, I don't know if there's any. Have you heard of any relationship between the, homogeneity of a country and the likelihood of clearing murder?
That's a good question. I don't think that stands out as a super important. I mean, it does sometimes. You do these multivariate analysis. You sometimes get, like language diversity, for example, sometimes comes in, but it's not probably as important as the sort of age structure of the society or basic economic factors like income inequality is a pretty good predictor of homicide usually. Poverty often is a decent predictor. I would say it probably plays a role, but not a huge role.
In homicide or homicide clearance, or both?
Both.
Okay, got it. Okay, and then, getting back to procedural justice, that's a big term in your work. I think people should understand it. What are some real world examples of procedural justice working well or failing in policing? Well,
I think maybe in the United States, the best example of this, there's all sorts of different labels for it, but it's all under the general umbrella of community-oriented policing, or cops, people say. And it's the idea again that the police are seen as an agent that's helping the community, that's working with the community, and even when they're interacting with somebody that ends up being guilty, that they're treating that person with respect and dignity, and letting them tell their side of the story. I think there's just a lot of evidence that the more that happens, the better the relationship between the community and the police officer. So I think that's really a good example of how it's worked. I would forward as an example of how it hasn't worked as well is this problem of having police both be out there investigating terrorism and political violence and also street crime. And I don't have actually a good solution to that because, police, they're like something like 1 million police officers in America and just a few thousand FBI agents interested in terrorism. So if you're interested in stopping terrorism, you cannot do it very effectively without the police. But this idea of police seeing themselves as sort of SWAT teams and coming in with all kinds of, almost military-grade equipment also has some downsides, I think, in terms of how the community perceives them.
Yeah, they're posturing something that isn't for the community, but maybe is more attuned to the state.
Yes, like an invading force from outside the city or outside the state, yes.
Yeah, and you see that dichotomy perhaps starkly when it comes to protests.
Yes.
Right? You've studied protests and unrest in the U.S. How does the legitimacy of the police change during those kind of times?
Well, I think it depends very much how they respond, basically. Again, you first have the idea that the protest itself is a kind of legitimacy crisis. In the book I referred to a couple of times, one of the things I looked at is protests in the United States. And if you look at protests and crime rates, they track each other pretty well. Because you think about protests represent a legitimacy crisis of some kind. You're protesting because you're saying this institution is not doing the job or not doing the job fairly. And you see this, in other countries, not just the United States, but certainly in the U.S. during the 60s and 70s, lots of protests. So, I think the way police handle protests and the protest itself, they're both linked to legitimacy and trust in the system.
Yeah, got you. I mean, and so talking about, modern times, you say that you've seen, especially during the COVID era, we'll call it, right, this uptick starting to happen. We'll see how it trends. We just had an election. There was a sort of, they're calling it a mandate, I guess, right? Where they you've won all these you won a popular vote, et cetera, et cetera. People had a mistrust in the system. How do you see that now playing out? And what do you make of the perhaps mistrust in the COVID era and what the Trump second presidency represents? And Houdini-wise, how do you think that might unfold based on what you see happening?
Well, I guess I'd start by saying that I don't think history really repeats itself. Somebody said it doesn't repeat, it rhymes. Yeah. So I think there's some analogy between the period we're in right now and the period we experienced in the late 60s, early 70s. But I think it's also different in a number of ways. For one thing, we've had nothing like the crime boom that we had in the 60s. I mean, we did have an uptick in violent crime. It's already, though, been declining again. It wasn't nearly as large as the uptick that I studied back in when I did this book. So it's different than that. And I suppose, we also do have this we do seem to have a kind of legitimacy crisis, but it seems to be much more wrapped up now in new technologies and in social media, and the fact that people are having a much more difficult time coming to agreement about what's going on than the situation was in the 60s and 70s. It's just long before pretty much all of the computer revolution and the social media effect. So I think they're pretty different.
Yeah.
But I do think, there is still this connection, I think, between whenever we start to lose faith in institutions, it usually has repercussions. Essentially, it frees us to get outside the lines, essentially. It says, why the hell should I follow the rules when the system's unfair? Yeah.
I mean, and so we've seen that in two examples that get compared, I think, often. Maybe you can help us. Maybe if you've touched those topics. It's a little off the cuff from what we had talked about prior, but it was just on my mind now. We see George Floyd protests, and we see January 6th commonly intertwined or interlinked or compared about, or, this is an example of fairness and this is an example of unfairness. What do you make in your professional diagnosis of the two and their similarities and differences?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess we're actually doing some work on the January 6th, whatever we call this. And what's interesting to me we actually have criminal record data on most of the participants of January 6th, those who have been convicted. And what I find interesting about them from a political violence terrorism standpoint is they're an extremely diverse group. You have, they have the Proud Boys and the Three Centers and other kind of right-wing terrorist organizations, but you also have a lot of people with no criminal record. You have older people, more highly educated people. You have people that have never been in a kind of major protest before, that I think have been swept up into almost a social movement that came there feeling patriotic about it. And you have like a whole range of people outright people who are coming there to cause all kinds of mischief, and people who are willing to use violence, to people that sort of wandered in thinking that they were helping the country, I think.
Yeah.
So really a diverse group. I suppose probably if you drilled down and looked at some of the Black Lives Matter protests, you probably would find quite a bit of diversity there as well. I mean, unlike a lot of the terrorist attacks we've looked at in our database, the group there, in both cases, the groups are way more diverse. You might have had people coming there planning to do mischief of some kind, but you had a lot of people that just thought it was the right thing to do. And so very interesting. More like, in a way, you think about, you see that sometimes like with abortion clinic stuff, where you get people who are out to kill people, but then you have this kind of social movement attached to it as well that involve a bunch of people that probably would never use violence but are very supportive of the underlying premise.
Yeah, so a singular cause can galvanize, unusually diverse populations of individuals into actions that are outside of the norm.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so you sort of see that so I guess that's a similarity between the two.
I
right?
think
Perhaps
you could at a very macro, broad level say that both of these are instances where people are not trusting the institutions to be doing the right thing, and they mobilize.
I agree. Yeah, like George Floyd, pretty obvious, and then those who believed what they heard from the soon-to-be president, the president-elect, believed that Mike Pence was the heir of all evil, and that there was a lack of legitimacy in the preceding election, right?
Yes.
I mean, versus obviously the lack of legitimacy of the police. You're coming to protect me, and you're going to put your knee on my neck. Right. And so I guess those are both instances of that same force coming to play and coming to bear. Do you see stark differences, really?
Well, I don't want to overdo that, because I think there are, also big differences in that. But I do think like the argument at the legitimacy level, I think, makes some sense. I mean, both, as going back to what we've been saying before, whenever people really distrust major institutions, in the case of George Floyd, the judicial system, in the case of January 6th, the political system, when they distrust it so much, they're coming out and even threatening to use violence. You've got some issues, basically.
So, I mean, if you were gonna, what do you think is the best way to restore legitimacy when it's been lost?
Well, there is a bit of good news here. Again, going back to the reason we have institutions is because they're malleable. I mean, it wasn't like, these were dropped by, some foreigner from Mars, right? I mean, we create these damn institutions. They should work in our behalf. And one of the things I find that's interesting both about crime waves, it's true with crime waves, it's true with terrorism waves, is we tend to, as humans, we eventually figure them out. I mean, we eventually do better. Like, people really, I think, fundamentally don't want to live in extremely violent communities all the time, and they come up with solutions. It may take us a while, But the good news is these are not, it's not instinct. It's not biological. We're creating these social institutions. So we just have to do a better job. And, we, following the crime wave of the 60s and 70s, we had a crime drop that was just as big, a huge decline in crime in the United States. And we've never really gotten back to that same level of crime that we had in the 60s and 70s again, thankfully.
Thankfully.
And as a researcher that's studied terrorism a lot over the last couple of decades, I've always been impressed that terrorism does not stay in the same place. It moves. So like in the 70s, the hotspots for terrorism were mostly North America and Europe. You had groups like all of the protest groups in the United States that got violent, and even in Canada with the protests involving the Quebecois. And you had in Europe, you had the IRA, the ETA. And then you fast forward to the 80s, very much of that disappeared, and instead most of the action was in Latin America with the FARC and the FMLN. And then fast forward to after 2000, most of the action was in the Middle East and South Asia with groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So I got to think maybe one of the good things about humans is we do figure out how to deal with these social problems over time, and we come up with solutions that work.
Yeah. I mean, if you could change one policy to improve legitimacy, what would it be?
I think, doing all you can to build trust in the system. And I think, we've been shocked in a sense by what an impact the internet and social media has been on trust. Yeah. I mean, I think, back when we had 3 channels and they're all basically reporting the same news, we're just in a very different world than we are now. So, like, who can you trust when you're going online? I mean, are you going to trust CNN? Are you going to trust Fox? And when you have such differences of opinion across those different kinds of platforms, I think it's created a kind of crisis that, frankly, I think none of the tech giants who invented these systems ever expected. They were saying, oh my God, this will democratize the system and have all these benefits. And it does have, obviously, a lot of benefits, but also it's created this kind of legitimacy crisis in a way.
Totally. I mean, I think the last election played a big role in that. People are turning to podcasts more and more. Mm-hmm. People are turning to different sources of media to get their information. I know young people are looking at TikTok, figuring out, getting news from there and trying to get sources that are trustworthy, and having to, disregard the institution of providing truth. And trying to make sense of it in a vacuum once again of like, well, what side of the bed do I sleep on? Do I get married?
Yes.
What news? Who do I listen to get news that I can trust?
Exactly.
And it's tough. I mean, I hope that people tune in here to National Champion Radio, knowing that we bring on individuals who have won prestigious prizes, come and bring their own background knowledge, aren't saying that they're unbiased or that they're not themselves. They're just presenting their truth. And it's up to you to make that, to distill that. But we need probably far more critical thinking between individuals. And given the workload that's probably a necessity to make a living typically in America, especially like non-white collar, et cetera, like it's just not enough time to parse through all the different information about a certain story to try to come up with the truth, I think it is really interesting to see how the technology over time has impacted your work. To know that you were, starting this work so early back then in the 60s and 70s, well before, AOL, way before www, right? And now you have, we've transitioned all the way here coming into 2025 to, cell phones in everyone's pocket 24/7. That can just take people in just completely different directions. One example, this is probably not but that's I find interesting is like, it used to be that when you grew up with a certain group of people, if they were your age, you could talk about cartoons or like shows, and everybody had like a point of reference, regardless, as long as they were American, basically, even non-Americans. Oh, you watch this show or you watch that. Nowadays, good luck. Everybody's, oh, I do gaming, I do this, I did that, I watch anime. It's so many options. It's such a platter that trying to then have faith and that institution underlying is going to be really tough. I think we need more measures of transparency, perhaps. I mean, I'm not sure how else we would create more legitimacy.
Right.
Yeah.
And you can sort of see from that example, too, it's kind of like best of times, worst of times, because, I mean, I'm like a huge fan of movies, for example, and like or I can hear any music on the planet at the tip of my fingers whenever I want to hear it. So all of those things are incredible but as you say, they also bring a bunch of additional responsibilities and challenges.
Yeah. Do you have favorite movies? As a sidebar, I'm a filmmaker, so we take a little side deviation.
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, I'm just shocked at how much good media there is out there these days.
Yeah.
And at your fingertips, and it's like you can download it, sometimes 2 weeks after it comes out.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
No, it's a golden age for media, I think. So that part is really good. It seems like the challenge we're facing as a country or as a world is how to parse this technology in a way that we get the benefits without all of the downsides.
Yeah.
And you also think about you mentioned the cell phone, and not that long ago, a couple hundred years ago, when the world was mostly run by kings and queens, the good stuff was only you only had that if you were royalty. But anybody with a cell phone now has access to this unbelievable technology, and that's actually probably more democratically spread out than any technology in world history. So that I see as a really good thing. But then it also, is linked to these legitimacy crises. Who do you believe? Truth, et cetera, et cetera. So we have complications.
I mean, before we go international, last domestic example. You did some work at the University of New Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see a group like the Natives and work in reservations and how that's sort of being impacted? Missing and murdered Indigenous women. How does the framing of ethnicity or that kind of role play in criminal behavior?
Yeah, great question. And New Mexico actually is notable because it does have something like 15 major tribes. And I think it's a really interesting question, I think, a policy issue, that I had a number of students when I was teaching in New Mexico that were Native Americans who were the first generation not only to get bachelor's degrees, but to go on for advanced degrees, for master's and PhDs.
Wow.
And then I always found with these students, they had this really tough situation because, let's say you're a Native American who's gotten a PhD. There are no PhD jobs on the reservation for the most part. You have to go elsewhere to find a job. And so you sort of think, well, do I go elsewhere to take advantage of this new educational credential I've got? Or do I, and then risk sort of getting cut off from your culture? Or do I stay in place and face the fact that I'm not going to be able to find probably a white-collar job or a professional job on the reservation? And you think about that plays out for the whole country. Like, in areas that are declining, like some of the coal belt or some of the industrial belt in the Midwest, should social policy come in and try to keep people living there but provide money and look for jobs? Or should we say, move to where the job is, basically? You're going to get a lot more economic advantage in New York or Washington or Detroit than you are in some area that's declining. So I think it's actually a tough call that's really well illustrated by what's happened to Native Americans over time.
Yeah, and so then that sort of segregation or being put in a spot where there aren't those opportunities to come back and be a PhD, for example, somehow is part of the problem when it comes to crime, unsolved crime there, et cetera?
Yeah, so probably, undoubtedly true. That's underneath the situation because a lot of the at least the economic and even social problems that are connected with crime in general are certainly at work on reservations.
Yeah. Okay, and so switching to the geopolitical global current events, and we talked nationally for a bit, and this will obviously have its overlap in both cases. Maybe we start with and then we come back to the current events, and you START to frame that. So maybe you can explain what START is and what got you interested in it, and what's the impacts that it's have had on the world thus far.
Sure. Well, START stands for the Center for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. And it started almost exactly 20 years ago, and I was involved in originally setting it up. The story behind it might be worth recalling very rapidly, and it sort of explains how a criminologist got involved in studying terrorism. So I'd been doing a lot of work looking at international crime rates. I've been looking at, why do some countries have higher homicide rates than others, basically, and I've been using United Nations data to do that. And in about 2000 actually, one of my graduate students told me about a project it was being collected by the Pinkerton Global Intelligence Service, which is they're the same company that used to guard stagecoaches in the American West.
Oh.
They're still around.
Like a security firm.
They do detective stuff, but they also do counterterrorism stuff in different countries. So starting when we invented satellite technology, so late 1969, 1970, for the first time in human history, you could have an event taking place in Gaza or Israel or South America, and it could be sent back to any place on the planet, immediately.
Yeah.
And we start to find companies like Pinkerton would hire ex-intelligence officers to collect data on terrorism and record it. And then, you're a company, you're a Ford Motor Company, you're sending 2 people to Zimbabwe, you want to know what the risk of terrorism. The company would sell that information. And I think they didn't so much make money on the data, but it was a kind of icing on the cake of other sorts of things they're selling. Okay. So anyway, Pinkerton, a bunch of companies were doing this in the United States, particularly the United States and the UK. But back in 2000, Pinkerton decided that they were no longer going to collect the data. And their home offices are close to Washington. So I took the subway out, visited the Pinkerton offices, and said, I think people would really be interested in these data. And I was interested because I'd been studying homicide. So I'm thinking, well, this, in a way, terrorism is a kind of homicide. I'll just substitute terrorism for homicide. And to my surprise, they said, yeah, you can take the data back to the University of Maryland. So, I go out there with a couple of colleagues. We load all the data into our vans and drive back to Maryland. And then about 6 months later, 9/11 happens. And suddenly we're sitting on more terrorism data than even the government has. Because the United States really hadn't been that interested in terrorism. A little bit with the Oklahoma City bombing, but not much. And certainly not international terrorism. So suddenly there was this huge interest in terrorism, and we were sitting on a database that looked really relevant. But getting money to look at these, basically we had all this stuff in card boxes. It looks like big shoe boxes full of data. Yeah. And I had no money to turn it into a data set. And I started looking for money, but you'd think after 9/11 it would be easy, but it turns out that all of the bureaucracies were worried about, like the Justice Department, which usually funds a lot of the stuff I've done, they were a little nervous that this new Homeland Security Center was going to snap up all of their interest. And the last thing, Homeland Security was not really, they were more interested in, things on the ground initially. So eventually Homeland Security got interested in setting up what they called centers of excellence. The idea was to bring universities more into terrorism research. And when they announced a center of excellence that was going to concentrate on social causes of terrorism, I said, I've got this database. This is a way to get it funded. I got to do a lot more than that. We ended up getting a much bigger team together and so on. But one of the projects that was funded by this center that we eventually established was a global terrorism database that still to this day is the most widely used unclassified database on terrorism. It's used pretty much by every country, United Nations, but even groups like Doctors Without Borders. It's online if your listeners want to take a look at it. If you just go to the START website and look at START GTD. All unclassified, you can download it yourself, and it goes back, and it has around 225,000 terrorist attacks from around the world. It runs from 1970 to about 2021.
Okay.
And we did a bunch of other projects as well, but I think this was probably the one that I personally was most involved in, and I think got the most attention.
Yeah, that was a really big undertaking, and so you were kind of at the right place at the right time. You were
Totally.
interested, and then, unfortunately, obviously 9/11 happens, and it takes a little while to actually get people, the right parties, interested because there's a little, let's call it intergovernmental politics involved,
Indeed.
and getting in the way of actually start.
Yes.
What kind of just general stuff will people find in the database?
Well, the database would, if you're interested in how much terrorism happens in a particular community, you're interested in what groups are responsible, you're interested in how many people were killed, how many were wounded, if you're interested in what weapons were used, what strategies were used,
Wow.
anything, we collect about maybe 90 variables on each terrorist event. So it's the broadest of these databases. We call them event databases because what we try to do in the database is track every single terrorist event on the planet, wherever it happens.
Wow.
And you were
That's-
talking a moment ago about technological changes. When we started, we literally had card boxes, with one note card per. And at the end of the data collection, we were looking at about 2 million stories a day in some 70 some languages across the world using, and obviously we didn't have enough staff members to code all those stories, but using algorithms to figure out which of those stories were most likely to be bona fide examples of terrorism, and then, using humans to then do the final coding. So that has evolved dramatically in the last 20 years.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds really exciting, and comprehensive, really like a terrorism radar that's
Yes.
out there, beep, beep, figuring out what's happening, collecting stories from different jurisdictions, different countries, different places around the world,
Yes.
siphoning through it in real time and bringing it in and verifying it through a human to then say, this is what just happened there. These were the weapons. These were the people. These were, the casualties. This is what happened there. And now anyone who wants to use it can use it. And you were the one who helped in large part bring that to the world. That's really remarkable. And thanks for bringing that, because it's so
Well,
useful. I mean, I'm sure, like you said, companies back in the day, through this Stagecoach private security company, which is so interesting to me. I love that idea of that company. I feel like there could be a movie just on some of their episodes, or a TV show on like what they're doing throughout time. But yeah, that origin is pretty wild. And so I guess with that, what have been the terrorism trends, I guess, what's been changing over the last 20 years? And what are the new threats on the horizon?
Yeah, so basically, we now have about 50 years of data on terrorism around the world.
Wow.
And what we see basically is a pretty big increase in terrorism from 1970 to about 1991. And I think the collapse of the Soviet Union in 91 had a big impact. It really reduced the sort of, because a lot of terrorism were sort of proxy measures for warfare. If you look at, after the atomic bomb was invented, we've had no, world wars, but terrorism is a sort of cool war. So, you don't get Iran attacking Israel directly, but they can send Hamas and Hezbollah. So it's kind of less threatening. And you see that going up and then curtailing after 91. Then there's a kind of trough in worldwide events that goes, ironically, until 9/11, until about 2000, 2001. Then you see this big increase in events. And the nature of the events change over time. The first group, from 1970 to the collapse of the Soviet Union, tend to be a more conflict-oriented. They're sort of Marxist-Leninist or opponents of Marxist-Leninism, or opponents of communism. And then there's a kind of a mixture of different ideologies. And then this last big surge was much more religious, much more related to Islamist extremists.
That's the surge in what years?
So basically, they start in about 1999, and they peak with the collapse of ISIS in about 2014.
Okay.
Still around, much less now than there was in 2014. And what we're seeing, and when you talk about new developments, I think the biggest new development, particularly in the United States, to a lesser extent in Europe, is right-wing extremism, which it's always been in the United States, certainly, but it's become much more common, and it's become much more common than, say, a religiously oriented terrorism in recent years.
Yeah, I think about like the KKK or something. Maybe I'm misinterpreting them as a right wing domestic terrorist group,
No, we
especially when they
put
had
very
such
well.
legitimacy in government back then.
Yes, and they were around, for a long period in U.S. history, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, even in the last, I guess in the teens, they were still, David Duke was still around. I would hear his flutterings, but it seems like I haven't heard much, and they've kind of fell off the radar. But you've sort of seen that's sort of like let's call them like offsprings or some sort of offshoot. Is that how you would define a right wing domestic terrorist group? How do you define that? Is it the cause that they're interested in, basically? Is it that they have political causes versus like okay?
Yeah, I was just going to say our strategy with the U.S. data, so looking at extremism in the United States versus terrorism around the world, is a little different. Like for the world, we've been looking at events. So we'll code a bunch of data about the Boston Marathon bombing or the attack on the synagogues in Paris. Here, though, we're looking instead at individuals involved. So individuals who've been arrested or convicted or killed through some extremist cause for the United States. We've never had enough money on these projects in the United States to cover every single case like we do with the GTD. So we're only picking a sample of cases, but a pretty large sample. We've got data now on over 3,000 individuals in the United States who've been arrested, convicted, or killed in the pursuit of a political ideology. For the right-wing groups, we have a kind of basket of causes, but we look at those who are motivated by gun protection, anti-abortion, discrimination against minorities, discrimination against people based on their sexual preferences. So essentially discriminatory-related groups, gun-related groups, anti-abortion-related groups, and people who've actually been, more than talking about it, who've actually acted on it and done something that's gotten them into the legal system.
I see. And so, speaking of these global terrorists and terrorism in general, that's a global reach, looking geopolitically. Currently, there's quite a lot of heat. Things are festering and war is on the rise in multiple locations. We have obviously Russia, Ukraine. There's, the Middle East and everything that's happening in the Middle East. Looking firstly at Gaza, Israel, and Syria, how does your work on legitimacy apply to those global conflicts?
Yeah, great question. I should say before I answer the question directly, one of the I was saying a while ago that one of the good things about terrorism, it tends to move. The one part of the world where it has not moved in 50 years is Israel-Gaza. They've had consistently relatively high rates for the last half century. So an especially complicated part of the world.
Yeah, it is.
I would say legitimacy, though, and if you think about, in a way, terrorism is a legitimacy crisis.
Okay.
A terrorist organization, I think this is super well demonstrated in the case of Hamas and Israel right now, the current situation in the Middle East. Hamas is trying to argue that Israel is not a legitimate entity. And usually, if Hamas had a military as big and as sophisticated as Israel, they just attack them directly. They don't. So basically, terrorism is a technique used by a group that has less power than the group they're opposing. And they often use a kind of what we could see as a sort of jujitsu technique. So in other words, you try to attack the stronger party, you try to get them to overreact and show the world that they really don't deserve legitimacy. So in a way, it's a fundamental legitimacy problem that you've got when it comes to terrorism. That it's a kind of legitimacy crisis, and that you're trying to show you have more legitimacy than the group you're opposing. And for their part, the stronger group, the stronger military group, if they're smart, they're also trying to counter that legitimacy narrative. They're trying to say, no, we really are legitimate, and we have the legitimate right to strike back. So I think that really is, and I probably will separate a little bit the Syria situation from the Hamas, Israeli-Gaza situation, in the sense that, in a way, it's even more complicated. And a good example of how, as academics, everybody's now got an explanation for Syria, but where was that explanation 3 months ago, right? None of it. I don't think anyone saw this coming.
Yeah,
or at least
how fast the Syrian army went down was crazy.
Exactly. or for that matter, how fast Hamas walked into Israel. And I mean, we have this notion of black swan events, which things that are really hard to predict. After the fact, we all have explanations. But the Syria situation is especially difficult. I would say it's still a legitimacy crisis in a way. The Assad regime was having major legitimacy issues, but it's even more complicated because you've got so many players involved. You've got the Russians involved, the Iranians involved, the Turkish involved, the U.S. involved, as well as all of the different players on the field.
Yeah.
So what a complicated situation there. But I do think it is, again, it points out just how central these institutions are and how difficult it is when they've lost legitimacy within a given society.
Yeah. And so, I mean, Israel has been fighting legitimacy issues since its origin, right? Coming into that region, especially, let's just call it its 20th century origins.
Yes.
And so that's been a sort of long-standing pushback in that region. Then you have this situation of international law and how international law can play in its own. So I was trying to basically elevate or think about some of your work in those frameworks of the legitimacy of nations, right? We talked about institutions. Obviously, nation states are an extension of institutions. But then how does conduct then place people at a space where, a lot of other countries outside of the West don't see what Israel's doing is not good. And obviously, students have protested and people have pushed back on that. And so it starts to splinter in these various ways of, conduct-based legitimacy, which I guess gets back to brutality in a sense, right? Like, does brutality, you are legitimate just in and of yourself, but then once you act in a certain way, we start to see you as illegitimate, or, specifically with the rules of international law, if people start seeing those as being, just as institutional as they are, which aren't real, then people think, well, I can get away with this then if you do that.
Yes.
And then it's just a situation of might makes right, where, okay, well, I have the bigger stick and I'm the bully, so I get to do what I want and the rules don't apply to me the same way. How do you think through those ideas based on all your work and your studies? What are you seeing from your eyes?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's a really complicated. I mean, that's exactly the nature of a legitimacy battle. And I would say something that we haven't really brought into the conversation, but I think it's especially an issue with the Middle East, is I've done some work with colleagues where, in general, we would argue that as societies kind of liberalize, become more democratic, they can gain legitimacy essentially. So a pathway to greater legitimacy is more transparency, more trust, more openness. But that story is actually quite complicated in a way that I haven't really talked about yet. So, like in general, stronger democracies tend to have less political violence, also less crime, as like less interpersonal violence in general than not. But we did a study some years ago where we looked just at Middle Eastern countries, and there's basically about 14 Middle Eastern countries. And if you look just at those countries, you find stronger democracies are associated with more violence. They're associated with more terrorism. You found that countries that are more open have more terrorism. And you say, how can this be? It doesn't make sense. Well, you look at the countries involved, and you find out there's essentially no democracies in the Middle East except Israel. The others are all very transitional. They might have flirted with it a little bit. And what we see when we look at the sort of global picture in terms of terrorism is you have less terrorism when you have strong democracies, but you have even less terrorism with strong autocracies. Like places like North Korea, Saudi Arabia have very low rates of terrorism. And where you get the most terrorism in countries transitioning between the two. We saw this even with the breakup of the Soviet Union. Like for a while, there's all kinds of interpersonal violence in the former Soviet republics. Eventually, they stayed on the sort of democratic course, and now places like Poland and Czechoslovakia and so on are seeing their rates look like the Western Europe rates. But for a period, it's really difficult. So countries in the Middle East, like let's say Syria wants to become more of a Western-style democracy, they have to go through this sort of no man's land where they're likely to have all kinds of increased violence for some period of time where they hit a tipping point and then go off. Because the highest violence are in these transitional areas, which is almost the entire Middle East, Iraq, Afghanistan. So it's a really tough problem. And, we like to say, okay, if we were all democracies, we were all open, we'd be happy, we'd march into the light and everything be great. But the truth is, very authoritarian regimes are also quite good at controlling violence in a very different way, just because they are so repressive. And moving from an authoritarian to a more open democratic society has this cost of going through this sort of no man's land where, everything gets more complicated.
Yeah. You don't go from breaking out of freedom and slavery into a formal, concrete, and established institution. You go to the desert.
You do.
You go to the desert where you have to then create rules, start at the bottom, try to build your way up.
Yes.
And those countries you noted seem to have, well, just the few you named recently, seem to have that American intervention in their very recent past. So, I mean, how has the role we've played?
Well, Andre, what's interesting about I think we had 14 Middle Eastern countries. What I think is left out of this, though, is quite a few of them are actually success stories with regard to terrorism. So I'm thinking now Qatar, Dubai, United Arab Emirates. They actually have very relatively low rates of terrorism in those. So the Middle East itself is extremely variable. You have countries like Iraq and Syria, but you also have some that have very, very low. So if you could somehow get the Palestinians and now maybe the Syrians looking more like Qatar or Dubai or some of the successful parts of the Middle East, there might be some hope for the future. But getting there is not obviously an easy task, and no one in the world has been able to come up with a solution. So
I mean, because I don't have we haven't invaded Qatar, right, and these other countries, so it doesn't seem like the American interventions are a positive thing for these nations.
Yeah,
it doesn't seem like stability is the future of Syrians.
No.
It seems like instability, perhaps. I heard about a former jihadi. What's the legitimacy of this individual now? I guess he said that he had a change of heart over the years from being. He's a top 10 most wanted person. Yet we're probably going. He's in your database. He's probably done some of the most heinous things that any human has done. I'm sure if he's at the top 10, he's done some really heinous things. Yet now we're looking to legitimize him, perhaps, as the head of Syria. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what do you make of that? What's going on? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think, in a way, Iraq, Saddam Hussein was no, fantastically great guy. But on the other hand, some of the problems caused after he was gone, you could argue, were even worse. And I think probably... Yep. I hope that's not right. I hope Syria pulls this off. But, if you're going to be a betting person, you'd say they certainly are going to be facing some major challenges.
Yeah, certainly. And so, trying to legitimize a leader like that in such a, chaotically diverse, entrenched, it's a really complicated and unfortunate issue, I guess. And it speaks to terrorism and crime and its origins and stability and your work.
Although we can say, there's plenty of examples in the database of individuals and groups that we labeled as terrorists that end up being elected into government positions. Look at the IRA, the ETA, the FARC, even the Israelis. They had Israelis used terrorist methods against the British when they were looking for independence, and some of those people became major leaders in the new nation. So we do have examples of people that have transformed from being seen as users of terrorism to, because you have to think about we talk about terrorists, but really what we're talking about people who use terrorism or don't, right? In a way, terrorist kind of is a misleading topic, because what we're interested in is whether you're using terrorism methods in sort of, it's quite possible you're not always a terrorist.
Yeah, you just have had maybe some advances or offenses that you utilize terrorism, right? And that's part of your your toolkit as someone trying to maybe form a state, take over a state, maneuver in these ways. Do you think that the balance between legitimacy and conduct of war, use of terrorism, use of certain types of war that erode your legitimacy, do you think that Israel in particular has done a good job of balancing that? It seems to me like, based on what the rest of the world feels, regardless of the truths of their own defenses, perhaps how we feel as Westerners about their position on certain things, not collectively as Westerners, because we all disagree, which is the great thing about America, right? We can disagree and continue to move forward. But it seems to me that irregardless of what you believe to be the right thing, whether or not you were blocking aid or whether or not this other offense was right or wrong in the playbook of international law, it seems though if you're eroding your legitimacy, especially with states, like China or these other kind of really major powers who may see that as a door to open up their own kind of can of worms, it seems that you don't want to erode. I would say that the global perception of Israel before October 7th is much better than it is today, unfortunately.
Yeah, I can't disagree. I mean, look at how the United Nations votes have been going.
Yeah, the United Nations votes say a lot about how the global, and that's in turn making it tougher for Americans.
Yes.
And so it doesn't seem like they've been balancing properly the use of their own state legitimacy and how, your state reputation, being a pariah state, plays into how you can leverage your own reputation with trade, with, commerce, with, globalism, in a sense. It seems that it's been imbalanced and that they haven't made the right calculations. But listen, it's easy to be an armchair. What do they say? An armchair quarterback.
Quarterback, yeah.
Yes, it's very, very easy, and I don't like that's obviously harder than being a NFL coach. It's much harder, and so I don't want to pretend that it's an easy proclamation to make.
Yeah, I definitely hear that, but I think I'd have to agree with you. I think Israel's done much better on the battlefield than in terms of the media, for sure.
Yeah, and they've eroded that. What would be one piece of advice to offer world leaders trying to prevent unrest? What would it be?
Well, maybe outside my purview a bit, but I think, if you think about what sustains countries to some extent, we've been saying it's legitimacy of institutions, but it's a sort of myth in a way, right? That at some level, a belief that you're really striving for equality or you're striving for the very best lives for your citizens, or whatever the myth is. I think you have to get a lot of people to sign up for that. You have to have them believe it. You have to be persuasive. And if you start losing that, you tend to disintegrate as a country or as a society. So building that, and I think there has to be some, hopefully some evidence that you can't just say it. You have to, not just talk the talk, but you have to walk the walk as well, and show evidence that that people really are doing better under the particular regime that you're trying to put on them or have them support.
What's your quick take on leaders like Zelensky and Putin and how they maintain or lose legitimacy?
Yeah, well, I thought, again, you talk about how bad we are at predicting history. I mean, I think almost everybody I talked to was expecting Ukraine to be knocked out in a couple of weeks.
My goodness,
and here it is now over or coming up on 3 years. And I think here's this guy who was a kind of comedian that's been such a pivotal player in this. Again, I don't think any of us saw that coming.
Yeah.
And Putin... I think it's pretty clear he regards the collapse of the Soviet Union as one of the worst events in recent world history, and I think would like to restore it. And I sort of find it personally, I've gone to the Soviet Union or Russia over the years and 20 years ago, I think a lot of people held out the idea that it could become like Western Europe, a country from the Soviet bloc, and in some parts of Moscow or St. Petersburg, you could feel like you were in the West. But
I've been to St. Petersburg. It did feel like that.
Right? I mean, but now it just seems like it's gone in a completely different direction. So I'm, not happy about it, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah, it's unfortunate. Any views on, legitimacy based on how they've been, what do you make of that claim of his legitimacy based on NATO expansion versus the legitimacy of invading another sovereign nation, right? I mean, I guess, what do you make of those distinctions?
Well, I guess I'm probably responding more as a citizen than as a scientist on it, but I guess, to my knowledge, NATO's never attacked another country. I think, certainly, I don't think the motivation of Sweden and Finland and the other countries that have applied recently to get into NATO have any interest in attacking Russia. So it seems to me to be a bogus claim. But it also, I think it points out that this terrain is not easy, because from what I can tell, at least, Putin has a pretty strong support from at least a majority of Russians. Not everyone, obviously. There's been a lot of pushback as well. But, you'd like to say, again, that if you just have an open, transparent system, you're likely to be over all your problems. But I think the world is more complex than that.
Yeah. Unfortunately, right? I mean, and it's such an interesting way into the complexity of the world, starting with the simple question of, why do people commit crimes?
Right.
And that has just opened up the world. They say you have to go in very narrow in order to get back to the expansive, or else you're not tuned in to anything in any real way. And so through that question, over the years, it's expanded into this terrorism database, into these views about the world, into the work that you've done studying crime and street crime, and getting into communities, getting into police brutality, and being able to say things in those times that aren't just of the moment. They're like, well, according to this and this and that in the 60s and this, and I can tell you that right now with the outbreak that's happening with Sandra Bland, it's a relationship towards something like this, or Breonna Taylor, or something like that. What are you sitting here at the edge of 24, going into 25? The first quarter of the century is going to be coming on to the last year. What do you see heading for the future? I know prognosticating isn't anybody's greatest skill, like you said, but do you have optimism?
Yeah, I do, but I guess I tend to be a sort of optimist by trade. And in fact, there's a lot to be optimistic about, and for a lot of the reasons we're talking about. I mean, we're in an unparalleled situation in world history in a whole variety of ways. I would argue that the world as a whole has never been more prosperous. Fewer people starving to death, people living longer. I mean, almost any metric except maybe the quality of the environment and climate change. Almost every other thing, we've been doing better. And the United States, if you travel very much, like our economies came through COVID in surprisingly good shape. So I think we have a lot of things that are sort of going for us, and hopefully we'll be able to, take care of this big problem we seem to have with a kind of two very different or very polarized views of where the country's heading. So I'm going to try to be optimistic. What the heck?
Yeah, why not? Why not, right? I mean, how much more time do you got? I want to be mindful.
I probably should be counting down a bit now, Andre. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Let's wind it down. Maybe one big question, and then just to kind of like wrap up, what you think about the future and all this.
Sure.
One more meaty question that may be useful. Speaking about crime in the United States, and you talked about this recently, that dichotomy between the left and the right and how they see crime. On one end, what's happening in San Francisco or these places where they just allow all these kinds of crime to happen. Decriminalization, I guess. We
Yes.
see people robbing stores and no one's stopping them. What's going on there? And then I guess on the left, on the flip side, they're looking at things in the lens of racially based crimes are still on the rise, still higher, still a huge disparity. We have a racist system, etc. I guess those are two separate questions, but that's the last meaty thing I'll bring to you as we start to wind down.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I guess the best data I have on this, because we spent quite a bit of time gathering data in Baltimore. And Baltimore is an interesting city from a standpoint of gun violence, because when we were studying, at least, it had, I think, the highest rate of homicides in the country, even higher than Chicago. And we went into this project thinking that after we looked, especially at the Freddie Gray case, which you'll remember from 2014, this young black guy that he was taken into police custody, bounced around in the back of a police van, and then died subsequently. Had huge repercussions in Baltimore, lots of civil unrest when he died. They actually brought in the National Guard. There was riots. It was a pretty big deal. And we had a lot of data before and after the Freddie Gray case happened. So we went in thinking, well, certainly after this high-profile incident, the black community is going to be less likely to call the police. And I thought, legitimacy 101, right? They'd be less likely because they're less trusting. And we thought, we didn't have individual data, but we had data on fairly low-level census data, so we knew what proportion of each tract was African American and what was other groups. Mm-hmm. So we run the analysis. We don't find that. We find not only were black people not less likely to call the police after Freddie Gray, they were more likely to call the police. So we went back to the drawing board, and we had other data as well. We had data also on how many crimes were happening, how many violent crimes, how many gun-related crimes, and also how many arrests for gun-related crimes. Well, make a long story short, we found in Baltimore after Freddie Gray that the number of violent crimes increased significantly and increased almost entirely in black neighborhoods. So you start to think about, we've known for a long time that African Americans are less likely to trust the police than other groups. And that's been a statistic for a long time. But you think about if you're worried about crime in your neighborhood, who do you call, right? You're not going to call the library or the sanitation department. So you're stuck with the police. Even if you don't really like it, you're stuck with it.
That's right.
So that was the first thing. The second thing is arrests for violent crime declined significantly only in black neighborhoods.
So the police were less engaged.
Yes. So ironically, the well-intentioned protests over Freddie Gray, I would argue, made things worse in black neighborhoods. You first had an increase in crime, and you had a decrease in black protection.
Wow.
And so I think, I don't know if this splits. I think what this tells you in part is you got to follow wherever the data. And this is just Baltimore. So I know it could be different in Portland or San Francisco or other places. But I do think, we have to be on guard on the situation where, and we actually, for this project, we actually hired a guy who was from the community who had committed a murder and done maybe 20 years for murder. And I showed him this data, and he said, I could have told you that off the top of my head. So I think we have to be careful. You sort of get, well-meaning academics like myself going in, with a particular story. But if you look at, the folks that really got sort of in worse shape because of Freddie Gray, ironically, were predominantly black neighborhoods.
Wow.
So I think it's really important to stay open to that. And it's kind of the flip side of sort of some of the protests that came out of Black Lives Matter. So obviously you need to get the police doing their job. On the other hand, where do you need well, you need policing where the people are threatened the most.
Right.
And if you do surveys of inner city folks living in inner city communities, a lot of them are in favor of police. They just want good policing. They don't want people breaking down their doors and not treating them with respect.
No,
so
for
I
sure.
think we got to do both. This really dawned on me is, on the one hand, if you just go in, you need the Black Lives Matter stuff is exactly right, because if the community doesn't trust the police, they cannot be effective. On the other hand, if you just abandon the police, that's not going to help either. You have to, and as I say, when you're solving 36% of the most serious crime of murder, That's not a good police system. You need both. You need to have, the police have to show respect for communities, and especially, minority communities, but you also have to have law and order functioning.
Certainly. Yeah. I mean, that makes total sense. People.
Thank you. I think it does.
Yeah, it makes total sense.
It does to me anyway. I'm quite energetic about it.
Yeah, no, it's unfortunate that people, that there's a dogma or a one-track mindedness in academia and a lot of spaces about certain outcomes. Like you mentioned with the ice cream, right?
Yeah.
Like certain outcomes, we're rejecting that, and then it doesn't get out to the further. And so then somebody on the street who's done 20 years could tell you, like, of course, who else am I going to call when the police, right? And then all this unrest that's happened from looting stores and all of this, well, people start saying, well, I'll just come in your house next. Right, it's in the mind. I've already done it. It's in the air. I've been in those situations. It's in the air. It's the energy. Now, young teenagers, they're going to go out and do some more crimes, perhaps. And all of a sudden, now there's spite coming from the police. They're less likely to come in and do anything about it. And so, but then from an academic lens, you wouldn't expect those outcomes, and you get surprised by them. And even more so, you may hesitate to put them out because you might not move forward as an academic, putting out things that are going against the grain. And that's unfortunate that people aren't just following the mandate of what science is supposed to be, which is just doing the data and saying what it is. This is what the data says. Isn't that what I'm saying? You know?
Yep, that's the challenge.
And then,
and I should say that in all of these, like things we tracked, they weren't permanent. It was like throwing a pebble into a lake. They sent out ripples, but after maybe 2 or 3 years, things had returned back to where they had been before, pretty much. So, I mean, it's not a problem that we have to. It's a problem we need to think seriously about, but it's not necessarily something that's going to go on forever.
Yeah. And then with decriminalization and shoplifting crazy, it seems like a similar reverse effect. What was that all about? And is that going to stop soon? Or what did you make of that? Was that the right thing to do? What's that like?
Well, I mean, it really is a tough problem because we know that, sending a lot of people to prison and jail, that they're not going to be better people most likely when they get out of that experience. So I think the society has to sort of bend over backwards to try to avoid it if it can, and there are costs associated with it. On the other hand, though, if deterrence is going to work, if the criminal justice system, I mean, we know from Criminology 101, the most likely from committing a crime is thinking you're going to get caught. And if that disappears, you're going to get probably more of it. So I think that's been a problem.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, last thing is, what would you give to young criminologists? What would you say to the future as they try to do what you do in, 20, 40, and 50 and 60?
I think it's a great time to go into the field. It's an exciting time. There's new data, there's new challenges, new methods. I don't think there's ever been a more interesting time to get into it. If you think about even studying crime, I mean, back in the day, you were looking at things like robbery and burglary. Now you've got, hate crime, bias crime, all kinds of cyber crime, all sorts of white collar crime. You just have a whole bunch of new criminal behavior that needs to have explanations and solutions that, weren't there before. So, yeah, I'd really encourage people interested in this field to get into it.
Well, thank you for coming on. Unless you got anything else, I know you got a split. So thanks for coming on. Thank you for giving your time.
My
to
pleasure.
National Champion
It's been fun
Radio.
chatting with you.
This has been such a great time.
Yep.
And so
Okay.
we'll be talking soon.